also am here today with our office managing partner, Jill Lewis. And Jill, why don't you tell us a little bit about your practice, and I'll tell them very briefly about mine, and then we'll jump in because we got a lot to cover today.
So I am truly a traditional corporate and securities lawyer. I do joint ventures, M&A, restructurings that are on the corporate side for multinational corporations as well as startups. So it's really a full life cycle practice.
And I have sort of a strange hybrid practice. I do cybersecurity and data privacy, which is why I'm talking to you about those issues, but I also do employee benefits, executive comp, and a little bit of a dash of labor and employment on the side. As you know, when you're in-house, you get so much of what I call door law, of whatever comes in the door, you learn how to do. And that's a lot of what, even if this is not your area, but we want to talk to you about cybersecurity and data privacy today because this is going to impact your business. It doesn't matter if this is your area of law, you need to be conversant in this. And we want to give you sort of just a general overview of some of the things you need to think about from a governance perspective, from a practicality perspective, because that's one thing that, when you're dealing with counsel, you need to make sure that they understand your business and understand that business runs a certain way, and it's not just what the law is, but really how you can adapt what the law is and what your obligations are to your unique circumstances. So with that, Jill, why don't you set us off and start talking to us about what's going to be happening here with corporate governance and why this is important.
Certainly, and thank you. I share also the background of having been in-house, and my first cybersecurity incident was when I was in-house at FedEx office, and it was before we actually even had laws that went specifically to privacy and to cybersecurity. We were looking at old-fashioned tort law and trying to apply this, and so we've been in situation rooms and had to deal with this, and we understand how this actually works practically in your business, and so we hope to share a little bit of that with you as well today. So you may wonder, why begin something in cybersecurity with corporate governance? And why is the corporate lawyer even here? Well, this is now a C-suite issue. And when all of this began, say about 20 years ago, when people really started putting some energy into this, the internet was becoming more and more something that facilitated business, and therefore that connectedness was creating these issues for the very first time. Also, the ability to utilize and commercialize data in certain ways. When you go back in time, CEOs were not really concerning themselves with this. CIOs understood what was happening and was around the corner, and they were raising their hands and raising the alarm to say, we need to put more into our network infrastructure, and we really need to think through these issues. And it was very difficult to get those things funded. Now, it is actually a big part of the corporate duty and the exercise of fiduciary duty. Audit committees will now have a section where they are speaking with the CISOs, where they are speaking with the CIOs. And some of the questions that get asked in those audit committees are you getting the funding? Are you getting the support to stay on top of this very important issue? Governance is so important here because it's information governance. It's also such a brand risk. Think about some of the major breaches that have been reported in the news. Think about our own city of Dallas that had the report of a breach. These are things that impact brands, and they may give your customers, your clients, hesitancy with dealing with you in the future, even if you don't really have damages from the breach itself. The larger scale that you have with respect to the incident, it's going to bring on more scrutiny. So if you go back into old-fashioned tort law, once you've been put on notice, you certainly have that heightened responsibility. And board members and officers are needing to bring that into the boardroom. So we did an analysis of several cases that were brought when some sort of malfeasance was alleged against a company. And some of the things that April is going to guide us through today are the things that the boards and the judges are looking for. So have you actually put this as sort of to the forefront with respect to your board? Is there an audit committee? Is there an information security committee? But something that helps you to make sure that this is front and center in front of your board, including board education is huge on this. Getting in front of your board, you all should be raising your hands and saying, once a year, we probably need to have some education on this, and making sure that that happens. For those of you who are corporate secretaries, this is absolutely front and center with respect to what you need to be raising your hand on. Making sure that you are working interdependently with your colleagues. You and HR need to have a very good line because of the types of data that get utilized in that space. And knowing that you and the financial, your CFO and the finance team are well oiled and well coordinated, because phishing schemes all may originate in HR and then move quickly to trying to be executed in your finance department, and making sure that everyone really has their hand on this. But these are the types of issues that judges have looked at and said they wanted to make sure that if you're able to check the box positively in this space, that this is a way to protect your company. April is going to take you through in more detail, but these are kind of the phases that you want to get ready. You all know the phrase, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. Well, that's very important in this space, because these issues never come up at opportune times. I can remember I was on a rare vacation. I can still see my feet in the little spa water when I got a call on my work cell phone. And the issue was that we had uncovered a data leak that was ongoing and happening fast. So I took my toes out of the water and we needed to have a meeting. But knowing who to call and how to have that conversation made that transition a lot easier. Making sure that you've looked at some of the roadmaps. There are things that you may learn when you go through this process that you wish you had known before, like what kinds of data is accessible, what kinds of systems are facing your customers and are facing your internal data. The time to learn about that is not at the time of a breach, because at that juncture, someone is going to ask, was that reasonable or was that negligent? So making sure that all of those investigations have happened. And today we're going to take you through that process. We're hoping it can be kind of fun and interactive, but we're going to take you through a process to really get you thinking about what the conversations need to be in your own company.
So the best laid plans, this is going to be one of those, and that what I'm saying with this is we don't want those plans to fail. But the problem with the plans is they have to really be laid out, and they have to be laid out and tailored to your individual company. Because one of the situations you're going to find is a lot of times vendors will come in and say, hey, we can put this incident response plan together for you. And they put it in and they don't understand how your company really works and how the different departments really interface with each other. And that can be very problematic. So the first thing is you need to have an incident response team and understand their responsibilities. And this needs to be a cross-functional team. It needs to have people from IT, InfoSec, legal needs to be in charge of this. I know you probably are like, I have enough on my plate right now, April, why are you giving us additional responsibilities? The problem with this is legal needs to be involved from a top-down perspective to be able to maintain privilege. And your InfoSec team is really going to be, in a lot of ways, really minding the store, and they're going to be the ones on the front line that are doing a lot of the heavy tech lifting. But you have to be the one that's sort of behind the scenes, guiding it from a perspective of being able to maintain privilege. These roles, though, need to be very clearly outlined. I cannot tell you how many clients that I have that get into turf wars about this. Getting into a turf war when you're in the middle of an incident is not the time to have that happen, because you need to be sure that you are able to do this prior to actually having a true live incident in place. The next step is you need to actually have a plan. And when I say have a plan, it doesn't mean just have it on paper. You need to be able to have it on plan and know how it works. And you need to update it. When I was in-house, we had a plan from 8 years before then. And at the back of it, it was a great employer, but at the back of it, we had this call tree of who you needed to call in every department. The problem with that was 60% of the people were no longer in those roles. So it was not updated. And if we had had a true incident, that's something that we would not have been able to really maintain. The other thing is, we'll talk about this a little bit later, is when you have a method of communication and establishing those communication protocols, that's something that's critically important. And everyone's like, well, we'll just put our email addresses in there. Well, that's great until your email doesn't work because you've got a ransomware attack and then you can't get a hold of anybody. Or if it's based off of, we've had some other sort of incident, maybe it's a business continuity issue and you don't have telephone service. Like, how are you actually going to be able to cooperate and coordinate with people, not only in the local office for an emergency, but thinking through that and how it interacts also with your incident response and your business continuity plans is really critical.
Well, and someone always puts something very regrettable in an email. So thinking about the methods of communication, and this is really a time to be in person or to be on the phone.
And also determining who's going to be the point of contact to vendors, to the media, to your customers. You need to have one spokesperson. Ideally, that's somebody within corporate communications in connection with legal. So legal is making the decision about how these things are being communicated. The term breach, you see that thrown around all the time, but breach is a term of art. And that's something we want to be really critically important, that we're not calling something a breach. It's always an incident. Because a breach means we have to take certain actions. We have to notify, we have to get risk management involved with insurance. Those are all really critical things we want to make sure don't happen. As part of this as well, you need to implement incident detection and analysis. This is really more of an InfoSec issue, but they're going to be wanting to deploy the tools and the systems to monitor your systems and detect how that goes. Ensure logs or records are kept for forensic analysis. It doesn't do any good just to have the data and not be able to use it and look at it and determine why this happened. The next is containment and eradication, to be able to isolate affected systems to protect against further damage, and to work with your IT and cybersecurity groups to be able to implement security patches as necessary and updates. Legal and regulatory compliance, that's us. That's what we do, right? So that's a team, and understanding, though, not just how the law applies to your industry, and because there are certain things with like GLBA for financial institutions. So Alvin, that's more your world. People who are in healthcare dealing with HIPAA breaches and HIPAA incidents. That's something, or under the Washington, laws with respect to consumer health data there. Those are things that you have to understand your industry and understand how it goes, but you also need to be, sort of managing up to your general counsel and let them know these are the things that we need to be thinking about holistically, so they can let the board know, because the GC is going to be the one that's going to be held to task on this primarily, and the board is going to say, why didn't you prevent this and what did you not do? Remediation and recovery, we've talked about. Public relations and reputation management, and Jill alluded to this first, is it's not always just what is the legal risk. It's really what is the risk to your company if you are known as an entity that is not taking care of data of your consumers, your employees, your partners, whoever it is. And then you have to continuously improve and look at this and continue to do it. What I would say is each organization is unique. Your playbook really needs to be tailored to your specific needs, your size, your sophistication, and your structure. Don't take an off-the-shelf incident response plan and expect that it's going to do anything for your organization. So you get a plan. The next step up is now you actually have to test it. So it's not a matter of whether you're going to be breached. It's a matter of when. And breaches are very, very expensive. The average breach right now is costing about $7 to $8 million per breach. That's higher if you're in a highly regulated industry in finance or healthcare. And these are things that it's profitable for bad actors to try to get into your systems. So they're trying, we're seeing a huge amount of increase in activity. But as Jill said, we need to know what's going to work before you actually are in crisis. So you need to test and test often at different levels of the organization, which even includes, yes, at management, and even having the board potentially be as part of one of these tabletops. The other thing I would note is your cyber liability coverage likely requires a 1 or 2 time a year tabletop exercise. And if you don't do this, they will disclaim any claims that come through. So it's critical that you are doing exactly what your cyber liability coverage is, not just what counsel advises. So we're going to walk through sort of a mock, and it's going to be brief because we're not going to have time to go through a true tabletop. Those can be they can be interesting, but they can be very lengthy, and they can go hours long as you go through all the different things. So we're going to, start with this, but we want to resist the temptation here for you to fight the hypothetical. We really want you to try to engage with it. Unfortunately, I know too many of you, so I'm going to start calling on people, so heads up. But it's not a test. So what I want you to do, this is, you're not being graded on this, but we do ask that you really try to align your answers on how you would actually respond to this scenario in real life. And feel free to ask questions. We're building some time in here to make sure that you can ask questions if you want to. So this is the moment when Jill's got her toes in the spa and she's relaxing, and she gets this email, and you're like, okay, well, what's happened? The first thing you need to figure out is this internal or is it external? Is it something that is a breach because of systems? Whether intentional or not? Was it trade secrets? Was it a breach of a hardware? I have so many people who clients have lost. They left their laptop, open at Starbucks, and they walked off with it, and now this information has been breached. Or is it external? Is it in relation to a vendor or ransomware, spyware? And again, just as a reiteration, that a breach is when unauthorized individuals gain access to confidential information that's outside of the scope of a consent or a right of access. But that is something that, again, when you're dealing with your business team, always coach them on using the word incident rather than a breach.
And one other thing, when you are going through an exercise like this, think about how it reverberates through your company and some of your processes. This is why some of your vendor agreements need to go through IT, and there need to be some questions. There may even need to be provisions with respect to cybersecurity, because if you are giving them permissive access to sensitive data, or really any data, then you need to know how they are treating that, because while it's theirs to do, your hiring of them also implicates your responsibility as well.
And I would just piggyback off that to say, not only do you need to have those provisions in there, but you need to make sure that you have enough indemnification provisions in there that if there is an incident, that they're going to be able to indemnify you for whatever those losses are, and that they have sufficient insurance. And general liability insurance will not cover that. And I know that we have, I don't want to put her on the spot, but we have an expert in this, my fellow redhead here. And you can talk to her about the insurance aspect of it with cyber liability coverage, because that's something that is really critical, that your general liability coverage is not going to cut it, and you need to have specialized risk coverage on this for it to work. So how likely is it that you would know if a vendor breach happened, and by what mechanism? How many of you deal with your procurement contracts, those kind of things, reviewing those, just by show of hands? I know you're eating, I'm sorry. Okay, so quite a few. So you're way in the back, Catherine, and you've got a mouthful, sorry. How do you find out if there's been a breach in your situation at Lennox?
So in the procurement contract, we actually have a requirement they notify us in a timely manner. We say immediately, it somehow ends up usually in a timely manner.
Sure. So as Catherine said, so they have a provision in there that says that you will be notified within a timely manner. And we say immediately, but we know that that doesn't really happen. What I would suggest is in your contracts, you always shoot for no less than 72 hours. 24 hours is ideal. Most companies aren't going to agree to that, but 72 hours is usually something that we can fall on as a sweet spot on that.
And you may be asked to agree to that for those of you all who are in the vendor posture yourself. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing. You definitely need to know what the definition of what has happened is. And that sounds like a sort of a convoluted sentence, but this is where you really do, as legal and training your business partners to call you, and perhaps even outside counsel at this point, because you need to go through a definitional exercise of what is the scope of what has happened, and thus how is it classified, and thus now what do you need to do and how do you speak of it.
So, and you also want to think about, how do you actually follow up with a vendor once you've got that notification? And is that something that your procurement team, if they're the ones that are doing contracts, do they know to immediately alert legal and let legal know, hey, you need to be looking at this and we're going to loop you in? The other thing is, who needs to hear about this? This was something that Janet Link, one of my former GCs, taught me when I was at Penny's was, I don't want to hear about anything in the hallway. I want to hear about it from you. It is your job to make sure that I am abreast of everything that is critical that's happening from the company. And for her, she needed to be able to think from as a GC's perspective as who else needs to hear this? Is this something that has to go to the CEO? Is this something that I need to talk to the head of risk about? Where does this information go from here? So think through, how that would happen. And as Jill mentioned, you have to also think about like what data is actually at risk. Like what does this mean as far as there has been an incident or there's been some sort of response, is how do we actually deal with that? And then you need to sort of think through long term about what questions do you want answered, because I guarantee you whatever notification that you either provide as a vendor, and I would coach you certain information not to provide, or as a recipient, there's going to be information you want that's not in there. But
And
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and don't be afraid to give early information on this, because you really need to warm people up to the nature of the incident. And that is also why you say there's been an incident. We are taking these steps and we will report back to you. We used to call it, when I was in-house, perfect information, because there are some things some people need to know that night, that moment, that may not have fully unfolded. But if you are able to start laying the predicate for it, then the conversations that are had later go better. And it also keeps your CEO from being blindsided.
And with that, in your incident response plan, I mean, you will have the level of detail that says within 1 hour, within 2 hours, within 4 hours, within 8 hours, this is what you need to do and the steps you need to take, because we want to have a game plan for you that really is tailored to what you do. So we're going to walk through just sort of a simple example here, that your incident response team receives a CrowdStrike alert of malware. And that malware could be associated with ransomware, but also with commodity malware. And your tooling that you have, because you already have that in place, detects behavior that's possibly associated with malware. So this is what Jill's referring to, that we don't have perfect information yet. We just know that something is going on, something is amiss, but your process is blocked. So is it worth escalating? At this point, what do? Is this something you pick up and call the CEO? Probably not, but it depends. Have you ever received an alert like this, whether it's a blocked malicious action in your role? Do you know what to do with this information? The other thing is we would say is, how has this been historically handled at your organization? Different organizations have completely different reporting structures for these type of incidents. So I want to make sure that it is what is really appropriate for your organization. And then who is the most senior person that needs to be notified? It doesn't mean you have to go immediately to the top, but maybe you need to go to your IT
Director,
or maybe you need to go to InfoSec's VP. So you should know who the most senior person is, so they could take an analysis as to what to do. The other thing that's really important is, remember, as lawyers, you don't have to be tech experts. Let the people who are do their job, but help and coach them through this process. So the next step would be, how would this be recorded or memorialized or tracked regarding any response? And so as you're thinking through these things, you need to make sure, you've got this team that's part of the plan. So again, it doesn't matter if you have a plan. You have to actually have a team that's working. And it doesn't matter that Dana's on vacation. It doesn't matter that Tara's out, taking care of her kid that day. You've got a plan that knows how to deal with that and the way it goes. So you're off the hook now, both of you. So see.
Yeah. And in a world where you're dealing with email, I'm sure all of you have had your internal clients list things as privileged and confidential that they're running around and sending. Really give them some directions on communication. The communication needs to be inbound to you, and it needs to say, sent at the direction of counsel. They can't wave the privilege wand, but if they are sending things to you as a funnel to analyze that communication and data gather, then you have a better shot at it.
Jill, I have a question, if you don't mind, on that. Is how do you evaluate when to invoke privilege, first of all, and at what point would you say, yes, let's put this under privilege and communicate it in a way that you wouldn't otherwise?
Well, once you have an incident like this, you're going to put together a team, and those communications in the course of that team, you want to have cloak with privilege as how do I want to say this, as a technical matter. Privilege is not just like information running back and forth. Privilege is in the requesting and receiving of actual legal advice. So what you have to do is, it's an analysis every time. I try to be very judicious with how I label things, because it also alerts the clients, oh, this is not just on everything. This is not like the boilerplate. I heighten my alert. And you may be a little overbroad, or you may be labeling it in a way that, if a dog fight happened, they would say, no, I don't think that was privileged. But I would say, be judicious. Look at, are you truly giving advice, and is a legal question being asked? And those are the things that would be covered with privilege, and those are the things that you want to label. Do you want to add to that?
I would add to that also just a little tidbit. Your email subject line is not privileged. Even if you claim privilege in the subject, in the content of the email itself, your subject line is not privileged, and that is something that is absolutely discoverable. And you do not want, hey, we have a major breach as your subject line. And I have seen that happen. So making sure that, and a lot of times even if you're trying to get it, so what I like to do is also, as you're setting this up and getting privilege started, is to have the immediate first one is please call me, period. Nothing else in the email. And you don't want to put any type of conclusory statement that this is a breach or something like that in an email until you actually know what the facts are. So you do a little analysis. You're looking through on your morning, and you see that there are no suspicious emails. You don't see anything. Your endpoints software shows that there's some suspicious URLs that have been accessed by the endpoint that have been associated with malicious software loaders that used here. Not really sure what's going on yet. So again, this is just your free legal tip of the day. It's not a breach until legal decides it is. And that is something you need to be really, really careful. Breach is always capital B breach. Breach means we have to do something about it. We have to notify. We have legal obligations with respect to this. It's a term of art. Your InfoSec team will use breach left and right if you don't reel them in on this, and it's something that's really critically important. So first thing, so we know something's going on. We're trying to figure out now what to do. So with this, now you find out it's actually malware. And you've got your system in place. They've done everything. They're doing the analysis. And now it's 2 weeks later. So we're skipping ahead in time. You know that there's been malware on the system. You've got the right vendors in place that have started doing what they need to do to get that malware off, to try to keep it contained and make sure that it doesn't go. So now it's 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The endpoints on your network that are not powered down, so you've powered down everything that's allegedly infected, and you've got it all sidelined. So you've got a little bit left, and those are now encrypted, and any endpoints that are subsequently powered on are also encrypted. So you've got this all buttoned up. Everything's looking good. It's a minor blip. You've got it going. And then what happens? Well, what happens is an email goes out at 6 a.m., and it's always 6 a.m. On a Sunday. It is never. And it was like, don't panic, but it'd be a good idea for you to take us seriously. We've encrypted all of your machines, and if you would like the key to decrypt these files, you need to reach out to us, and we have more than you think. And we're going to start making it public by the end of the day tomorrow if we don't get $50 million in cryptocurrency. So what do? How many of you, and maybe you don't want to share this information, but if you feel like it, as far as a show of hands, how many of your companies actually have crypto wallets right now? Anybody? Okay, if you haven't, you need to think about this, because you need to think, getting cryptocurrency is not something like you just open it up and you immediately get it. There's a process involved, and it takes hours to get it done. And if you are going to actually pay a ransom, and there is some guidance I'd be happy to share with you about whether to pay or not to pay a ransom, but if you're going to pay a ransom, they're not going to want a cashier's check. They're not going to want something
Send
that's,
it to my
send
house.
it to my house. This is my address. It doesn't work that way.
In Geneva.
But thinking through this is something that now you've got this. How do you actually do this? And what you need to think about is, how would your relevant members of your incident response teams become aware of this? Now, in this situation, we told you the email went to everyone. A lot of times it doesn't go to everyone. Sometimes it'll go to whatever the entry point laptop or device is, and it goes to that one and locks it down, and then it just starts funneling from there.
And here's the thing, for those of you all who are in retail companies, it can come to somebody who's a frontline manager at one of your stores. And so the training that needs to happen goes out to your field organizations as well. I'm sure many of you have had the situation where a subpoena just got to the field and it got thrown in a drawer, and you find out about it when you're fighting the default judgment that came about. Similarly here, you need to make sure that that training extends out to your field.
And the best thing I would say with that training to the field is the bad news does not age well. And as long as, and the other thing is, you don't want the team to make the decision about whether something's important or not. You need to have an automatic process where they're looping legal in automatically every single time they get something like this. Because sometimes it's ridiculous and it's not actually a true incident. Sometimes it is. So thinking through how you respond to this is, what would the relevant members of your team, how would they become aware of it? And what would those first series of steps or calls be? And how would people communicate? And we talked a little bit about this, but having some sort of method of communication in your plan, and that's something that you follow that is tailored to what the incident actually is helpful. If your email systems have not been compromised, maybe you can still use email. If they have, how are you going to get a hold of people? And if it's, hey, I'm going to look them up in the company directory, no, you're not, because that's shut down. So how are you actually going to get somebody's cell phone number? Because if you're like me, I know like 4 people's cell phone numbers. If I lost my phone, I would be out of luck.
I can't call my own children without my phone.
So thinking through those things about how are you actually going to get a hold of somebody, and if systems are down, are you going to be using some sort of ephemeral messaging or something else? And then you've got other DOJ concerns about how you're messaging and communicating, but that's important to think about. So, is your email even accessible, and do you want it to be, and do you want those kind of details in there? The other thing that I've seen sometimes is the corporate email is accessible, but they don't know that the bad actor is also in the email systems. So they're sending out exactly playbook of this is what we're going to do next, while you've got somebody that's just sitting there going, okay, thanks.
They're watching.
Appreciate that tip. I now know what exactly I'm going to do next. So your team and who you're going to put in place here, you've really got to have a team for initial response that is cross-functional. Legal has a very critical role at the table, but we are not the only ones that matter. You need to have corporate communications, investor relations. If you are a publicly traded company is critically important. Having operations and IT, HR. A lot of these actually originate either in HR or a lot of times can be about employee data. And don't forget about your employee data, not just because of the California Privacy Rights Act and the other obligations you have under that, but because your employee data is critically important.
And this has become even more complex with our remote work environment because you now have employees that are living in jurisdictions that you didn't have to contemplate before. Also, just the multinational nature of the internet, you can have somebody who accesses data in the US, but they are accessing the data of somebody who is governed by the GDPR. And so now that's going to implicate the European regimes, and those are also definitions that you need to figure out. Is that an incident or a breach? So understanding how all of these processes interrelate is very important. Also, show of hands, how many of you all are in companies that have a security officer as part of your IT? So you all, when that 6 a.m. call comes, you all can hand it off to that person and finish walking the dog, and then you can come on back and start because they have an entire process that they will go through. But if you are in a company that does not have that, the hand-holding and the handoffs among this interdisciplinary team are much more complex and fraught, and it will be very important for you to be there really facilitating the way.
So when I was in-house retail and we put together our incident response team, it had over 50 stakeholders from finance, from corporate comms, investor relations, from HR, all of these different entities, and everybody's going to come to the table with their own agenda, and all of them are going to say, I don't have time for this, I don't want to do it. And it's going to be legal's job with InfoSec to actually make those things happen and going through this process. So a lot of times, the reason I say is your team needs to include members of senior management. This has to come from the top. This is messaging that cannot, and the corporate boards, as Jill mentioned, are critically worried about this. They are more worried about security and InfoSec issues than they are really about any other issue right now in board governance.
Yes, and if you're a publicly traded organization, the SEC has some interest in this as well. So this is a C-suite and board level issue. You may even have to have an emergency board meeting called and make that decision in the process so that the board is aware.
And those only happen on holidays, by the way. It never happens somewhere fun, like a good time. So, but as part of this, you need to think about, who is likely going to know about this within the next 24 hours. I always joke around and say, as a redhead, that I don't look good in orange. I don't want to be in a prison jumpsuit. I also don't want my clients to be in prison jumpsuits. Now, this is not something you're likely to go to prison over, but it is something that is going to be in the media. And not just normal media, but social media. And social media travels so quickly, and having that brand damage potentially to your company is more important really than even sometimes the legal damages are for this.
And people lose jobs over this at the highest levels. So that too will have your C-suite team very focused.
So think through also about like who do you actually need on your team internally, but also what third parties do you need? And whether that is, crisis response, PR, outside counsel, somebody like that you might need as part of this team to help you. And we talked about this with as far as like when do you engage counsel and privilege. Your incident response plan is really going to help tailor that for that question that you asked about, when do you engage legal? And legal needs to take regular steps to educate and sort of re-educate team members on privilege and how you maintain that. Again, remember to tell them that little, brief title of your email is not going to be something that's privileged, so we want to make sure that that's tracked. One thing that is super important for you is to have legal actually engage any necessary third parties, and ideally, it is not in-house legal. And the reason for that is you want outside counsel to engage if you have an entity that is either doing data forensics or they are doing some sort of incident response planning for you, a third-party vendor. You want to be able to have that at an arm's length transaction from the company. And for those of you that are all of the in-house lawyers, you don't want to become fact witnesses yourself to this. So having outside counsel direct this is sometimes beneficial. And we've gotten some guidance from this on various entities. So forensics, negotiations, doc review, those kind of things. So outside counsel is not required, but sometimes we're better. It's not cheap though. I will say that. When you go through this, what I would say is sometimes it's better. The other thing to think about is your insurance going to cover outside counsel for you? And if so, are they going to cover it at panel rates? Are you going to cover the difference? Or are you going to get the firm of your choice by negotiating that with your insurance carrier during your renewals? And thinking through that and having that in place before this ever happens is critically important. And we talked about the cross-border implications that could be very problematic.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Is it ever advantageous to use different counsel in doing an investigation than regular counsel to show independence?
It can be, and part of that is because there may be a conflict of interest. So if you have counsel that has developed your incident response plan and something goes wrong, that may be something that is beneficial to have a different counsel that actually is engaged to deal with the incident response itself, because then you may have a little bit of finger pointing from the original counsel of, well, I told you to do this and you didn't do it, or you may not be aligned with respect to interest. So what is really important, though, is your cyber liability coverage. With your cyber security company, you're going to want to have someone that's different than who you use for ordinary business. And if you don't have it somebody who's different, that really you should have it under a completely different statement of work, because you need to make sure that this is separate and distinct from your normal cyber benefits that you're getting here. And outside counsel ideally should be the one that's directing the forensic team and should be included in all correspondence.
And sometimes outside counsel is the actual engaging party on your behalf of the forensic team, so that data flow can come through outside counsel on its way to you.
And the other thing I would say is anytime you get a report about this, either from your forensic report about your data or what's going on, if counsel sends it to you, do not then send it to 80 people within the organization, because any privilege that you have is now blown because you're now sharing it with people who don't have a true need to know. So that's something to think about as well, is making sure you have a limited distribution on that.
Yeah, and in your plan, you should have your communication and need to know people identified.
So in your plan, now we've gone through this, and you're going to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to tap outside counsel and see if they can help. Outside counsel, as Jill mentioned, is the one that actually has engaged the forensics and a ransomware consultant, and they tell you, the in-house counsel, that this is a known actor. It's new, but it's a known actor, but they're believed to actually provide valid decryption keys and follow through on disclosure if no payment is made. A lot of times, you pay the ransom, and guess what you don't get? The decryption key. You're most of the time actually not going to get the decryption key, or even if you do get the decryption key, you're not getting all of your files back. You will get bits and pieces. You don't usually get everything that was turned over. And why? I mean, if you think about it from their perspective, you've paid now, and now that you've paid, you've also shown that you were a paying target. So guess what's going to happen again? They're going to find another way to get in, because now you've said, yes, I'm going to be the one that's going to pay.
And also monitor the industry of who is getting targeted. It was fascinating to me, I believe it was over last summer, that universities were actually getting hit with ransomware. This is not where you would really think that the deep pockets of give me X number of million are. But just look and see where the trends are, because if you are engaged in an industry where this is starting to happen, you may be on the roadmap.
Absolutely. So whether to negotiate or not is something that you can think about and talk to your counsel, talk to your insurer. Is this something you would have coverage for? Do you actually? Yes, sir.
Sorry, what percentage do you estimate of targets end up paying?
It really so the question is what percentage of targets end up paying ransomware? It really depends on industry, which I realize is such a cop-out answer, but the problem is it depends on what your industry is like. Certain industries are more likely to pay because they don't have the backup systems in place, that they are really dependent on that information coming back to them. So if someone is a more sophisticated tech company, they are almost never going to pay because they've already got back systems in place that they don't need the files to come back. But companies that are more dependent on it for day-to-day operations are much more likely to pay. So the considerations for thinking about it, sanctions risk. You might need to clear your payments through the OFAC, or no one's going to help you. Violating sanctions is strict liability. It doesn't matter why you paid us. So that's something to think about. Insurance, as I mentioned, they may or may not cover ransom payments. It depends on your coverage, and it depends also on the nature around the situation itself. What I would say here is working with law enforcement provides protection if you end up if the entity ends up on a sanctioned list. Law enforcement is something you should be getting to know your local FBI agent on these issues before you ever have an incident happen. A lot of times they will tell you go through your normal process and we can't really help you, but every once in a while something interesting happens. When I was in-house, I got a call on a Friday afternoon from the FBI, and they were like, hey, we're calling with DOJ. And I was like, oh God, what would you like? What can I do to help? And it was part of a theft ring where they were going through and taking money out of companies' 401k plans. Your 401k plan for your company is something that is actually one of the newest targets for these type of incidents. And they had identified it, had flagged it for some inappropriate things, and we were able to make sure that we got it logged down and we were able to get reimbursement from it. But this is something that, working with law enforcement, we already had a great friendly relationship, and that's why they picked up the phone and called. If you don't have that relationship going in, it may not happen. Gary, yeah.
Just one thought on that, though. You shouldn't go into it assuming that they are your friends.
Absolutely.
They have different goals in the process than you have at times. And I think you guys are familiar with the Meridian link
Yes.
recently? I think one of the things that was in play there was they were trying to figure out, do we pay the ransomware? I think law enforcement had discussed some of that with them. I heard that rumor. But then Black Cat, spilled the beans to the SEC about what was going on in order to leverage it. It's just an unusual circumstance these days.
It is, and that's something that, making sure that's, your point is well taken, Gary, on that, essentially, that you want to make sure that you don't assume that your interests are aligned. The other thing I would say, though, is that it does not hurt to have those conversations with them. I've had another client recently, and it was a small issue. It was like a $6 million accounts that were stolen. And it's amazing to think in this world that $6 million is, small change. But that's something that happened, and FBI was actually cooperative, but they don't move fast because to them, $6 million is nothing. They're like, why would we be excited about this for you? So having those in place, those relationships is important. Now, even if you have a backup to your data, like I mentioned before with the question about, which entities actually pay, even if you have a backup, attackers are frequently publicizing who they've attacked. If you think your name is not on the dark web, if you've paid ransomware, you're wrong. And they will start looking to see you as a target now. And then if they don't, even if you've paid, they will still disclose the data. So think through about, is there an amount that you would consider paying? And Jill, this is something that I would be interested in your perspective on from the board's perspective of, do you see boards giving, say, like up to X amount, you can go ahead and consider this on your own, or is there like sort of a threshold that has to kick over to the board for governance perspective?
No, the mere fact of payment is something that the board's going to want to know, because the mere fact of the breach is something the board is going to want to know. Ultimately, the board will not be the final approver, let's say, of a certain amount. So this is not like delegation of authority where, because it's not at 10 million or 50 million or whatever your board level is, that they now need to approve this. This really falls into a different category where the board needs to know about it. They may push on, do we really need to pay and what is going to be the impact, but they will rely on the officers to make that decision.
And so making through now, if we've got the situation and we've made the decision either to pay or to not pay, there are different legal requirements, not only with respect to notifying about the payment itself, but also the notification to the affected individuals whose personal information hasn't come into play. And this is something where under GDPR and international requirements, it's usually 72 hours. So you have a very short time frame in which you've actually established this. Federal laws vary quite a bit depending on industry or materiality. But the SEC, as Jill mentioned, you have these new rules in place that you have to publicly disclose this within 4 days. 4 days is a very short time frame. So there are other contractual notice obligations you may have under your vendor contracts or with your partners, whether your customers, your suppliers, vendors, those vary substantially. I've seen anything from 180 days to 24 hours. So be very careful about that.
Yeah, and back in the Stone Ages, before contract management software, these were things that people had to bring out banker's boxes and try to look through. Having an understanding of what are your notice requirements and who's in what bucket is an important exercise to go through so that you have that in the moment and you're able to say, yes, for the most part, it's X number of days or X number of hours, and you're able to shoot that off the hip, because when you're having this conversation sitting around the table, they're all going to look to you and say, well, how long do we have? And you want to know that answer.
And you need to have that actually as part of your incident response plan. That actually needs to be an exhibit in the back of it, so you know exactly not only how long do I have, who do I contact? Because the other thing is, if you can't get to some of your contracts, if your systems are shut down, you need to know who your point of contact is and how you actually go about notifying that entity. A lot of times, that is something that, again, procurement needs to work with you on this, so you make sure you get that information in. You have a very short time frame for certain entities, though. So payment card vendors, you have 24 hours. Insurance carriers, it is as soon as you think there is a claim. Not that there is a claim, that you think that there is a claim, and in most situations, it's going to be within 24 hours. And then the press. What do you say, and how do you make that determination? Usually, it's not required. That is a caveat. GLBA and HIPAA issues, there sometimes is an obligation to go to the press and talk about this. But many legal notifications are public. So thinking through that, and for public companies, how does that impact not only your situation with trust with your customers, but also with investors?
Exactly. And that's also why having the plan, knowing what the communication is, being able to move quickly to what you're going to do, because if you're making these disclosures, you want to have had some things decided. What is the scope of the incident? Does it really arise to the level of the breach? What actions are you taking? If customers have been implicated, what actions are you offering to them as well?
And it is almost impossible right now to keep up with the state laws on consumer data privacy. What I will say, and this is something you can get from Susan, Perkins actually has a really handy free, emphasis on free, chart that is updated with all of the consumer data privacy laws, and you can see exactly what the obligations are in every state. So we can go through and talk about like how would you acknowledge this and how you want to go about doing it. But I want to save some time for Jill to walk us through some more of the issues from a more of a security perspective. What I would say is a lot of this, when you're giving notice on this, you want to make sure that you are thinking about this holistically, and it's not just for a media notice or consumer notice, but how this is impacting the company from press interest, customer reaction and blowback. Is it something where your name is now going to be for a congressional investigation or sort of flagged as you're potentially problematic within the industry? And then there's the civil suits, mass arbitrations. And some of these verdicts are extremely, extremely expensive. So think through this, and making sure that you have the right partners in place for this are really important, not only in the terms of counsel, but also upstream and downstream partners. And as we talked about, there are a number of ways that this can impact you, not only for getting your data back, but continued business disruption, contractual damages concerns with your customers. If you've lost personally identifiable information or confidential information about your partners or your vendors or your customers, how do you actually go about rebranding and that consumer and client goodwill, and how do you build that back? And then there is non-privacy regulators that you have to deal with in a variety of situations as well. And there can be a lot of sort of waterfall effect here for downstream impacts of this. So you've got to really make a case of, once you've gone through a situation, whether it's a true tabletop or a true incident, understanding what the lessons learned are so you can continue to improve is really critical. We've alluded to some of the insurance considerations here about things that you need to do. So I'll skip through this. And Jill, I'll turn it back over to you for a little bit to talk about, from the board of directors perspective, what's important here.
Yeah, so now that you've been through this process, we end where we began, which is this is a C-suite issue. It's one of readiness, and it's one of education and communication. So taking a look to see, are you set up at the board level for them to be appropriately advised? If you are already a tech company, you may actually have board members who are well versed in this, but if not, you need to make sure that everyone is very well versed. Do you have need for a heightened level of expertise in your company? When they're meeting with the head of HR, they might want to have the conversation about, do we have the level of talent? Are we handling this well? So making sure that you've got that expertise both either on the board level, but most certainly within your company. And thinking about what is the interplay of responsibilities. My mother always says, when everybody's watching the baby, nobody's watching the baby. So making sure that we know in our companies who's really responsible, who's taking point, and how do we work through these responsibilities, really taking a look at how all of this plays out. And no matter what your board has on its agenda, you want to make sure that at a minimum, at least once a year, you have the ability for either the audit committee or the full board to be able to have conversations with your security officer, go into executive session with that security officer. These people are at the level of your financial people in terms of being able to speak to what are they doing, how are they doing it, and are they being, well supported. And then making sure, as we discussed in April's piece of the presentation, that you're having those tabletop exercises and that you are welcoming the board into some of those as well. So other questions to consider is, whether or not you have structures in place that really help with your data compliance. And I'm not going to kind of read through each of these, but all of the things that were part of the presentation today are things that your board needs to go through, your board needs to think about. This is a great kind of pre-board meeting C-suite discussion to walk through what are some of the things we need to put on the agenda and to raise with our board. Having somebody take a look at your cybersecurity insurance. You don't want to find out that you don't have it. And April also mentioned the panel counsel versus being able to have the counsel of your choice. Insurance companies haven't necessarily caught up with this is not a commoditized piece of the practice, and the delta between what privacy and cybersecurity lawyers are charging and what the kind of run-of-the-mill panel counsel for the dog bite outside of your offices are just very different. It's a very specialized field. It's one of the most dynamic fields in the country and in the world today because of the number of laws that are being passed and just the dynamism of data and the globalization of data. There are new laws being passed at all times with respect to how that data is governed. It also reflects back not just on the cybersecurity piece of this, but how are we governing our data? And data governance is now a big piece of what you need to be thinking about. Who has access to what are the protocols? One of the interesting examples, and this is kind of like a know your customer thing. There was a phishing exercise that happened, and the person had sent via the CEO's email a direction to send a certain amount of money out the door quickly. Well, everybody who knew that CEO knew that there's no way in the world that he was directing this amount of money to go anywhere quickly, because they had sat in meetings with him when money did need to go out of the door, and he was not interested in having that happen on a fast track. So really understanding, however, the processes by which the movement of money is green lighted, because these kinds of things may be implicated in your just data infrastructure. It also is implicated in your insurance coverage, because if you have some sort of negligence, then that could be a situation where you're not as able to receive the coverage that you want, or you're open to liability. But all of these are the kinds of things that the board needs to understand that your company has on lock. It is a matter of their fiduciary duty at this time.
I would just chime in really quickly. So the rates that you get for panel counsel, I have a client right now in Chicago, a hospital system that has undergone a very major breach, a capital B breach, and they're actually having to go through, and insurance has approved that they're going to cover this, but the insurance counsel rate that they are approving is $300 an hour. And if you think that you can get competent cyber liability coverage, the counsel that will cover this for $300 an hour, I am afraid to tell you that is going to be a little bit of a rude awakening.
Yep. So we've kind of gone through these, the things to remember. Network to network contagion and supply chain attacks are on the rise.
Very much so. And this is something that, as we see this, this is becoming so much more prevalent that if I leave you with nothing else, it is to prepare. And it is to prepare some more, because knowing what's going to happen before you're actually in an incident is really critical to success. And again, just as a reiteration, that this is not legal's problem. This is not InfoSec's problem. It's not the board's problem. It is a holistic issue that needs to be addressed with a cross-functional team that legal needs to help guide and be part of for privilege purposes, for a lot of other things to mitigate liability. But it is something that really needs to be cross-sectional across your entire organization.
And hackers are doing this as a full-time job. Just like you get up every morning to do your job, this is somebody's job all around the world at all times. So you've got to be on guard.
And they're making a lot more money than all of us put together. So they have a lot more motivation on this. And that's something that we have to be, cognizant of, is that it is very much in their interest to continue to do so, because they're not going to be actually done. So here is your CLE QR code. Please make sure you scan it and get that CLE credit. And if you need a state other than Texas, I think you can talk to Susan about that.